The world of dating did not collapse overnight, and it did not collapse by accident. It collapsed slowly, quietly, and then all at once as millions of people woke up to the same realization at roughly the same time. What was once sold as a miracle of modern connection has become a cautionary tale about incentives, behavior, and consequences. This video is not just about dating apps or relationships. It is about how an entire social experiment failed and what that failure tells us about the future. Stay until the very end, because the ending of the story explains far more than dating. It explains why so many men chose peace over participation. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all if you want more great Angry Guy content and want to get every single video the moment we release it. These conversations are not happening anywhere else in this way, and if you want to stay ahead of the curve, you need to stay connected. Also, take a moment to check out Angry's Crypto Academy if you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth by learning how to buy, sell, and trade crypto. The Academy is linked in the description of this video, so go check it out now while it is fresh in your mind. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Online dating was originally sold as a simple idea. Two strangers, both looking for connection, would be introduced by technology, have a short conversation, and then decide whether to meet in real life. That was the promise. What people actually got was something very different. Dating slowly transformed into a marketplace where attention became currency, validation became addictive, and people stopped seeing each other as humans and started seeing each other as profiles. Over time, the entire system shifted away from genuine connection and towards status signaling, filtering, and endless comparison. For men, the experience became one of constant effort with minimal return. Hours of swiping, crafting messages, and trying to stand out resulted in silence, rejection, or conversations that went nowhere. For women, the experience became one of constant attention with diminishing satisfaction. Hundreds or thousands of matches created the illusion of endless options. But very few of those interactions led to anything meaningful. Both sides were unhappy, but the system rewarded behavior that made it worse rather than better. As the years passed, dating apps did not correct course. They doubled down. Algorithms were tuned to maximize engagement, not happiness. The longer users stayed frustrated, the more likely they were to pay for premium features. Boosts, super likes, subscriptions, and visibility perks turned dating into a pay to compete environment. Men were encouraged to spend more money just to be seen. Women were encouraged to filter harder and raise their standards even further. The apps were not designed to create relationships, they were designed to create dependency. By the time we reached the middle of the 2020s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. User numbers began to fall, match rates dropped, conversations dried up. Men quietly deleted the apps in massive numbers, not because they were angry, but because they were tired. They realized that the emotional cost was not worth the outcome. They realized that peace felt better than constant rejection. They realized that their time and energy could be better spent elsewhere. Women, on the other hand, were told for years that men were disposable and easily replaceable. They were encouraged to believe that there would always be another option, another message, another man waiting. When men started leaving, many did not notice at first. The app still showed matches, the attention still trickled in. But over time, the quality declined. The pool shrank, and suddenly the same men were appearing again and again. The illusion of abundance began to fade. This shift had financial consequences that mirrored the social ones. Dating app companies that were once valued in the tens of billions saw their stock prices collapse. Revenue declined. Subscriptions dropped. Layoffs followed. Executives began talking about reinvention, artificial intelligence, and new features. But the core problem remained the same. People no longer trusted the system. Once trust is gone, no amount of branding can bring it back. At the cultural level, something deeper was happening. Younger generations were watching what happened to older users and deciding they wanted no part of it. They saw the burnout, the frustration, the emotional exhaustion, and they opted out before getting fully invested. Surveys showed a growing preference for meeting people through real life activities, shared interests, and existing social circles. The idea of swiping through strangers began to feel unnatural rather than exciting. Men, in particular, reached a breaking point. For decades, they were told to improve themselves endlessly in order to be considered worthy. Be taller, earn more, be more confident, be more emotionally available, but not too emotional. Be traditional, but also modern. Be strong, but also sensitive. No matter what they did, the goalposts moved. Eventually, many men realized that the game itself was the problem. Walking away was not an act of bitterness, it was an act of self preservation. Men discovered that being alone was not the same as being lonely. They found that solitude offered clarity, stability, and peace that constant dating never provided. They redirected their energy toward their careers, hobbies, health, friendships, and personal growth. They stopped seeking validation from people who did not appreciate them. At the same time, the social messaging toward men had become increasingly hostile. Masculinity was framed as something to be corrected rather than understood. Normal male behavior was often portrayed as suspicious or problematic. Men were told they were not needed, not wanted, and often not welcome. Over time, they listened. When someone tells you repeatedly that your presence is unwanted, eventually you believe them. Public spaces became more tense. Approaching someone was no longer a social skill, it was treated as a risk. Men were warned constantly about saying the wrong thing, looking the wrong way, or being misunderstood. Many decided that the safest option was disengagement, not because they hated women, but because they valued their own well being. Online culture amplified these dynamics. Public shaming became normalized. Recording strangers, sharing stories without context, and labeling people based on single interactions became common. Trust eroded further. Men learned that one misunderstanding could damage their reputation permanently. They adapted by minimizing exposure. Meanwhile, many women began to feel the effects of the system they had been encouraged to support. As men withdrew, dating events began to skew heavily female. Social gatherings that once relied on male participation struggled to attract men. Complaints surfaced about the lack of eligible partners. The same voices that once said men were unnecessary now asked where all the men had gone. This moment exposed a fundamental misunderstanding. Many men realized that they were valued primarily for what they provided rather than who they were. When they stopped providing attention, time, money, and emotional labor, the interest faded. That realization was painful but also liberating. It clarified priorities. Men began simplifying their lives. They reduced expenses. They focused on comfort rather than status. They invested in environments that rewarded them rather than drained them. Minimalism was not about deprivation, it was about removing unnecessary stress. Without the pressure to perform in dating, many men reported better mental health and greater life satisfaction. This shift did not happen in isolation. It coincided with broader economic uncertainty, rising costs of living, and changing social norms. Men assessed the risks of traditional relationships and decided the cost benefit analysis no longer made sense. They chose stability over chaos, predictability over volatility, peace over constant negotiation. As men adapted, some women struggled to adjust. The same behaviors that were rewarded in an attention saturated environment did not translate well to a smaller, more selective pool. Expectations built during the height of dating app culture clashed with a new reality. The mismatch created frustration on both sides. Technology offered an alternative escape. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Virtual companionship, digital entertainment, and online communities filled social gaps. While not a replacement for human connection, they provided low risk interaction without the emotional toll of dating. For many, this was enough. The urgency to pair off diminished. The collapse of online dating is not just about apps failing, it is about incentives failing. Systems reward behavior, and the dating system rewarded the worst instincts while punishing the best ones. When enough people recognize that, they leave. No system survives without participants. This is where the story becomes larger than dating. It becomes about what happens when trust breaks down between groups, when communication turns adversarial, when accountability disappears. The dating collapse is a symptom, not the disease. Men walking away is not a trend, it is a response. It is the natural outcome of years of messaging, policy, culture, and incentives aligning against male participation. When people feel unwelcome, they leave. When leaving improves their quality of life, they do not come back. As this continues, society will need to grapple with the consequences: fewer relationships, lower birth rates, weaker social bonds, more isolation on both sides. These are not abstract issues, they are already happening. What replaces the old system is still unclear. Perhaps smaller communities, perhaps more intentional connections, perhaps a rebalancing of expectations. But one thing is certain: the old model is gone. This is not about assigning blame for the sake of blame. It is about understanding cause and effect. Actions have outcomes. Cultures shape behavior. When one group disengages en masse, it is a signal worth examining rather than dismissing. The men who walked away did not vanish. They are still here. They are just no longer playing a game they believe is unfair. They are building quiet lives, focusing on personal fulfillment and refusing to be shamed for choosing peace. And that is where this story really begins. What many people still fail to understand is that walking away was not a sudden emotional reaction, it was a calculated adjustment. Men did not gather in secret rooms or plan a coordinated exit. They simply compared their effort to their outcomes and chose the option that preserved their energy. When enough individuals make the same rational decision independently, it creates a visible shift. That shift is what we are watching now. It looks dramatic from the outside, but from the inside, it feels calm, logical, and overdue. For a long time, men were told that if dating felt difficult, the solution was always more self improvement. If you struggled, it was because that you were not good enough yet. Earn more money, improve your appearance, improve your communication, improve your emotional awareness, improve your lifestyle, improve your social skills, improve your mindset. Improvement itself was not the problem. The problem was that the promised reward never arrived. The finish line kept moving, and eventually men realized there was no finish line at all. At the same time, the standards being promoted were not rooted in shared growth or partnership. They were rooted in consumption. Men were expected to bring value while being told that their presence alone was not enough. Many heard statements like, "I am the prize," or "I bring the table," without seeing reciprocity in effort or appreciation. Over time, this imbalance became impossible to ignore. Relationships stopped feeling mutual and started feeling transactional. Online dating magnified this imbalance because it stripped away context. A profile reduced a person to a handful of images and a few lines of text. Nuance disappeared. Patience disappeared. Everyone became instantly replaceable. If a conversation slowed down, there were dozens of others waiting. That environment rewarded detachment. It rewarded treating people as options rather than individuals. Men who were serious about connection found themselves competing in a system that discouraged seriousness. As men stepped back, many experienced something unexpected. Their stress levels dropped, their focus improved, their finances stabilized. Without the pressure to impress or chase, they gained time. Time to think, time to rest, time to pursue interests that had been neglected. This was not a retreat from life, it was a re engagement with it on their own terms. Social narratives often framed single men as incomplete or lacking. Yet many men discovered that they felt more complete than ever once they stopped measuring themselves against external approval. They built routines that served them. They invested in friendships that were reliable and drama free. They created environments that were calm rather than chaotic. This stood in stark contrast to the message that happiness required constant romantic validation. Meanwhile, the dating market continued to destabilize. Events designed to bring people together increasingly struggled to attract men. Organizers noticed the imbalance. Conversations shifted from excitement to concern. Articles began to ask where the men had gone. The same culture that once dismissed male withdrawal as insignificant now found itself affected by it. The response from the dating industry was predictable: more features, more subscriptions, more promises. Artificial intelligence was introduced as a way to optimize matches, improve conversations, and predict compatibility. But technology cannot fix a trust problem. It cannot manufacture desire where motivation is gone. It cannot convince people to re enter a system they no longer believe in. Younger generations observed all of this closely. They saw the emotional toll on older users, they saw the burnout and cynicism, they saw the endless loops of expectation and disappointment. Many decided to opt out early. Instead of downloading apps, they focused on building skills, careers, and social networks that did not revolve around dating. Romance became a secondary concern rather than a central pursuit. This shift also exposed how much of modern dating was built on imbalance rather than cooperation. When one side has overwhelming leverage, the system feels stable until participation drops. Once participation drops, the leverage disappears. That is what is happening now. Without a steady supply of male engagement, the entire structure weakens. Some observers try to frame this as a temporary phase. They assume men will eventually return once conditions improve. But this misunderstands what has changed. Men did not leave because conditions were slightly unfavorable. They left because they learned that their happiness did not depend on participation. That lesson does not unlearn itself easily. There is also a deeper issue of trust that cannot be patched over with incentives. Trust is built when people feel respected, valued, and safe. Many men no longer feel those things in modern dating environments. They feel scrutinized, tested, and disposable. Rebuilding trust would require cultural change, not just platform updates. At the same time, economic pressures play a role. The cost of living continues to rise. The expectations placed on men in relationships often remain high. When men look at the financial and emotional risks, many conclude that the return is uncertain at best. They choose to allocate their resources towards stability rather than uncertainty. This does not mean men have abandoned human connection. It means they have become more selective about where they invest it. They value environments where effort is reciprocated. They value relationships that are calm rather than volatile. They value clarity over confusion. Some critics claim that men walking away is a sign of weakness or avoidance. But avoidance implies fear. What we are seeing is discernment. Men are not hiding, they are choosing. They are deciding what aligns with their values and what does not. That distinction matters. As men disengaged, the cultural conversation shifted. More voices began to acknowledge the imbalance, more discussions emerged about burnout, loneliness, and disillusionment. the narrative slowly moved from blame to analysis. This is a necessary step if any meaningful change is to occur. However, meaningful change is slow. Culture does not pivot overnight. Incentives take time to realign. Many people are still operating on outdated assumptions about dating dynamics. They assume the old rules apply. They do not. The result is confusion. People talk past each other, expectations clash, frustration grows. This confusion is not accidental. It is the residue of a system that prioritized engagement over outcomes. When the system breaks, the confusion remains. Men who have stepped away often describe a sense of clarity that they did not expect. Without constant evaluation, they see themselves more accurately. Without constant comparison, they appreciate what they have. This clarity is difficult to give up once experienced. The conversation about dating often focuses on surface level behavior, but the deeper issue is alignment between values, incentives, and outcomes. When those are misaligned, participation declines. This is not unique to dating. It applies to workplaces, institutions, and social systems as well. Online dating failed because it rewarded the wrong things for too long. It rewarded attention over intention. It rewarded volume over depth. It rewarded performance over authenticity. When those rewards stopped satisfying users, the system lost relevance. What replaces it remains uncertain. Perhaps smaller, community based connections. Perhaps slower, more intentional approaches. Perhaps a period of recalibration where fewer people date, but those who do are more serious. What is clear is that the era of endless swiping is over. Men walking away is not about punishment or revenge. It is about opting out of a system that no longer serves them. It is about reclaiming agency. It is about choosing peace. As this movement continues, it will force uncomfortable conversations about expectations, about accountability, about reciprocity. Those conversations are necessary. Avoiding them will only prolong the imbalance. The future of connection depends on whether people are willing to confront these realities honestly, without denial, without slogans, without assigning easy villains. It requires examining how behavior shapes outcomes and how systems influence choices. Men have already made their choice. They chose stability, they chose clarity, they chose a life that feels manageable rather than draining. Whether society adapts to that choice remains to be seen. And this is not the end of relationships, it is the end of a specific model of dating that prioritized scale over substance. The next chapter has not been written yet, but it will not look like the last one. And as we move forward, the most important lesson to remember is this: when people discover peace, they protect it, they do not trade it easily. What makes this moment difficult for many to accept is that it does not fit neatly into the stories people are used to telling themselves. For years, the assumption was that men would always adapt, always chase, always compete, and always accept whatever conditions were set in front of them. That assumption held only as long as men believed there was something meaningful on the other side of that effort. Once that belief collapsed, the behavior collapsed with it. Systems do not survive on obligation alone, they survive on perceived value. One of the most overlooked aspects of the shift is how quiet it has been. There were no protests, no dramatic announcements, no viral slogans demanding attention. Men simply stopped showing up. They stopped initiating. They stopped pursuing. They stopped spending money on platforms and dates that felt one sided. Silence replaced noise, and silence is far more disruptive to systems built on constant engagement. In the past, loneliness was often used as a warning. Men were told that if they did not participate in dating, they would end up isolated and unhappy. What many men discovered was that loneliness had less to do with relationship status and more to do with emotional strain. Removing constant rejection, pressure, and uncertainty reduced loneliness rather than increasing it. Peace filled the space that frustration once occupied. This realization challenged a core narrative that had been repeated for decades. The idea that a man's worth was validated through romantic success lost its power. Men began to define success on their own terms: financial stability, personal freedom, physical health, mental clarity. These became primary goals rather than secondary ones. Dating, once central, became optional. There is also an important distinction between isolation and solitude that is often ignored. Isolation is being cut off against your will. Solitude is choosing to be alone. Many men transition from one to the other. That shift in agency changed everything. When solitude is chosen, it becomes restorative rather than draining. At the same time, many women were encouraged to view men as interchangeable. This idea was reinforced by technology that made replacement seem effortless. When replacement actually became scarce, the psychological adjustment was difficult. Expectations shaped in an artificial environment struggled to survive in reality. Some people respond to this by doubling down on old talking points. They insist men are afraid of commitment or emotional growth, but fear does not explain why men report greater stability and satisfaction after disengaging. Growth does not always mean adding more complexity. Sometimes it means removing what no longer works. The dating apps themselves became symbols of this failure. Once marketed as tools for connection, they now feel like reminders of exhaustion. Even those who remain on them often describe a sense of obligation rather than excitement. The emotional tone shifted from curiosity to fatigue. Attempts to revive engagement through artificial intelligence and automation misunderstand the root problem. The issue is not matching efficiency, it is trust. Trust that effort will be met with respect. Trust that intentions will be taken seriously. Trust that participation will not result in unnecessary stress. Without trust, no amount of optimization matters. Men who walked away often describe a recalibration of their nervous systems. Constant anticipation and disappointment were replaced with predictability. Predictability allowed for deeper focus. Focus allowed for progress. This feedback loop reinforced the decision to stay disengaged. Another factor that cannot be ignored is reputation risk. In an era where interactions can be recorded, shared, and interpreted without context, many men decided the risk outweighed the reward. One misunderstanding could carry long term consequences. Opting out eliminated that exposure. This does not mean men stopped interacting with women entirely. It means interactions became more cautious, more limited, and more selective. Men began prioritizing environments where expectations were clear and mutual. Ambiguity lost its appeal. As participation declined, some voices attempted to shame men back into the system. Accusations of immaturity or avoidance surfaced. But shame only works when people believe they are doing something wrong. Men who found peace no longer believe that. The broader economic environment reinforced these choices. Rising costs, unstable job markets, and uncertain futures made risk management more important. Men assessed relationships not as ideals, but as investments of time, energy, and resource. When the expected return was unclear, withdrawal was rational. This rationality is often misinterpreted as cynicism. In reality, it is realism. Men are responding to observable patterns rather than promises. They are trusting outcomes over narratives. This shift toward pattern recognition represents a broader cultural change. What we are witnessing is not a rebellion, but a reallocation. Men are reallocating their attention, money, and emotional energy. They are investing where they see tangible benefits. This includes careers, businesses, fitness, travel, hobbies, and friendships. The emphasis on self preservation is not selfishness, It is sustainability. People cannot endlessly give without receiving. Burnout eventually forces a correction. Men reached that point collectively. As dating participation declined, the language around relationships began to change. Concepts like effort imbalance, emotional labor, and value exchange entered mainstream discussion. These conversations were long overdue. However, discussion alone does not fix incentives. Change requires shifts in behavior. That is where resistance appears. Some people want the benefits of old systems without the responsibilities. That tension remains unresolved. The decline of dating apps is a visible indicator of deeper dissatisfaction. When people leave en masse, it signals structural failure. Blaming users misses the point. Users respond to systems, they do not create them. Men walking away also highlights how little room there was for male vulnerability. Expressing dissatisfaction was often met with dismissal or ridicule. Leaving quietly became the most effective response. This pattern mirrors other areas of society where participation declines when voices are ignored. Withdrawal becomes the only form of feedback left. It is a powerful signal, even if uncomfortable. What happens next depends on whether people are willing to listen. Listening requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some assumptions were wrong. That is difficult, but necessary. The future of connection will likely be smaller, slower, and more intentional. Fewer people will date casually. Those who do will expect clarity and reciprocity. This may reduce volume, but increase depth. Men who have stepped away are not hostile to connection. They are cautious. They are protective of their peace. Any future engagement would require clear value alignment. This recalibration period may last years. Cultural shifts move slowly, but once patterns change, they tend to persist. Men have learned something fundamental about themselves and their needs. The most important insight from this entire process is that systems cannot rely on guilt or obligation. They must offer genuine value to all participants. Dating lost sight of that. As we move further into this new phase, the old narratives will continue to clash with new realities. Confusion will persist until incentives realign. Men are no longer waiting for permission to choose themselves. They have already done so. The question now is whether society will adapt to that choice or continue pretending it did not happen. And as this unfolds, one truth remains constant. When people find a way of living that brings them stability and calm, they rarely abandon it for chaos. One of the reasons this shift feels so unsettling to many observers is because it exposes how dependent modern social systems had become on male participation without ever acknowledging that dependence openly. For years, men were treated as an unlimited resource, assumed to be endlessly available for attention, effort, protection, provision, and emotional labor. When that assumption stopped being true, the system did not know how to respond. Scarcity revealed value in a way abundance never did. For a long time, men were socialized to believe that endurance was virtue. If something felt unfair, the answer was to endure it quietly. If something felt draining, the answer was to work harder. Complaints were framed as weakness, silence was framed as maturity. Men internalized this messaging and carried it for decades. Walking away was not rebellion against responsibility, it was a rejection of silent endurance as a life strategy. What changed was not men's capacity to tolerate discomfort, but their willingness to do so without purpose. Tolerance without reward is not strength, it is erosion. Over time, erosion weakens even the strongest structures. Men recognized that erosion in their own lives and chose reinforcement instead. This choice created a visible contrast between those who stayed and those who left. Men who stayed often continued to experience frustration, confusion, and emotional volatility. Men who left reported calm, clarity, and improved focus. That contrast became difficult to ignore. Behavior spread not through ideology, but through observation. The cultural response often missed this entirely. Rather than asking why disengagement felt rewarding, the focus stayed on moral judgments. Labels were applied, motives were questioned, but labels do not change outcomes. Outcomes change behavior. Another critical factor is how modern dating blurred boundaries. Expectations were rarely stated clearly, roles were undefined, assumptions replaced communication. Men were expected to intuit shifting standards without feedback. When misunderstandings occurred, accountability often flowed in one direction. Over time, this ambiguity became intolerable. Clarity is not about control, it is about safety. People feel safer when expectations are clear. Men who walked away often describe relief at no longer navigating ambiguous social terrain. That relief reinforced their decision. This also intersects with how conflict is handled. Healthy systems allow disagreement without punishment. Many men felt that disagreement in dating contexts carried disproportionate consequences. Silence became safer than expression. Withdrawal became safer than engagement. The rise of public judgment culture amplified this effect. When mistakes are permanent and forgiveness is rare, risk avoidance becomes rational. Dating, once a low stakes exploration, became high stakes exposure. Men adjusted accordingly, and it is also important to understand that this shift is not driven by a single grievance, but by cumulative experience. One disappointment can be dismissed, a pattern cannot. Men trusted patterns over promises. When patterns repeated, they responded. As men focused inward, many discovered that fulfillment did not require constant validation. Achievement without an audience became satisfying. Progress measured privately felt more authentic. This internal orientation reduced dependence on external approval. This independence is often misunderstood as detachment or coldness. In reality, it reflects emotional self regulation. Men learned to generate stability internally rather than seeking it externally. That skill changed how they approached every area of life, and social pressure to re engage often ignores this transformation. Asking someone to return to, to an environment that disrupted their stability is unlikely to succeed. Stability is protective, people defend it instinctively. The longer this disengagement continues, the more normalized it becomes. What was once unusual becomes expected. Younger men observe older men choosing peace and adopt similar priorities earlier. This accelerates the shift. At the same time, some women experience genuine confusion. They were taught that abundance was permanent, that attention was guaranteed. Adjusting to a smaller pool requires recalibration that many were not prepared for. This is not about blame, it is about mismatch between expectation and reality. Expectation inflation is difficult to reverse. When standards are set in an artificial environment, reality feels like deprivation rather than normalization. This perception gap creates frustration on both sides. Men, having recalibrated downward toward simplicity, experience satisfaction. Women, recalibrating downward from inflated expectations, experience loss. These emotional trajectories move in opposite directions, making reconciliation difficult. The conversation often stalls here because it becomes emotionally charged. But emotion does not negate reality. Systems function on participation. When participation drops, systems adapt or fail. The dating industry attempted adaptation through surface changes rather than structural ones. Cosmetic updates cannot address foundational trust issues. Without trust, engagement cannot be sustained. This pattern mirrors failures in other institutions. When people feel unheard, they disengage. When disengagement spreads, institutions weaken. The lesson is consistent across domains. Men walking away is not an attack on relationships, it is feedback. feedback that was ignored when spoken verbally and amplified when expressed behaviorally. Behavior is the most honest form of communication. It cannot be dismissed as easily as words. When millions of men make the same choice, it demands attention. The uncomfortable truth is that many systems relied on male sacrifice without acknowledgement. When sacrifice became optional, participation declined. This is not malicious, it is predictable. As men reclaim agency, they redefine fulfillment. Fulfillment becomes about alignment rather than approval, about sustainability rather than intensity, about peace rather than performance. This redefinition has ripple effects. Consumption patterns change, entertainment preferences change, lifestyle choices change. Men prioritize environments that respect their boundaries. The cultural narrative often lags behind these changes. Media continues to promote outdated models of success, but lived experience speaks louder than messaging. Men who have stepped away often express gratitude for the clarity they gained. Clarity about their limits, clarity about their values, clarity about what they will no longer tolerate. This clarity makes manipulation ineffective. When someone knows their boundaries, pressure loses power. That is why shaming narratives fail to reverse disengagement. The next phase will likely involve renegotiation of norms, not through slogans, but through lived behavior. Norms change when incentives change. Whether society responds constructively or defensively remains uncertain. Constructive response would involve listening, accountability, and mutual respect. Defensive response would involve denial and escalation. History suggests that denial delays adaptation but does not prevent it. Reality eventually asserts itself. Men walking away is not a temporary pause, it is a structural shift, one rooted in self awareness rather than anger. As this shift continues, it will force deeper questions about how connection is defined, how value is exchanged, and how respect is demonstrated. Those questions cannot be answered by technology alone. They require cultural introspection. And until that introspection happens, the pattern will continue. Men will choose peace. Systems that do not offer it will be left behind. What is rarely discussed openly is how much emotional labor was expected of men while simultaneously being minimized or dismissed. Men were told to listen more, empathize more, adjust more, and accommodate more. Yet when they expressed fatigue or concern, the response was often to question their motives or character. Over time, this created a one sided emotional economy where giving was expected, but receiving was uncertain. No relationship model can remain stable under those conditions for long. This imbalance trained men to suppress rather than communicate. When communication was punished or ignored, silence became adaptive. Silence then evolved into distance. Distance eventually became disengagement. None of this happened suddenly. It followed a predictable progression that many men can trace clearly in hindsight. Another overlooked factor is how dating culture gradually replaced cooperation with negotiation. Instead of two people working towards shared understanding, interactions often felt like strategic positioning. Each side guarded leverage. Vulnerability became risky. Authenticity became conditional. In that environment, sincerity feels naive rather than admirable. Men who value directness found themselves at odds with a system that rewarded ambiguity. As men disengaged, they discovered that many of the anxieties they had normalized were not inherent to life, but specific to dating culture. Once removed from that context, those anxieties faded. This realization was powerful. It reframed past struggles not as personal failures, but as environmental mismatches. The concept of compatibility shifted accordingly. Compatibility was no longer about chemistry alone, but about shared expectations, mutual respect, and emotional safety. Without those foundations, attraction felt hollow. Men became less willing to pursue connection based solely on surface appeal. This shift also altered how men evaluated success stories. Instead of admiring those who appeared popular or admired, they paid attention to those who appeared calm, grounded, and content. The metrics changed, status lost relevance, stability gained it. Men also became more aware of opportunity cost. Time spent navigating dating frustrations was time not spent building skills, businesses, or experiences. Once that trade off became clear, priorities shifted decisively. The idea that disengagement is rooted in resentment does not hold up under scrutiny. Resentment keeps people emotionally attached. Disengagement reflects emotional resolution. Men did not leave because they were angry. They left because they no longer needed validation from the system. This emotional resolution is often mistaken for apathy. In reality, it is selective engagement. Men still care deeply about what aligns with their values. They simply no longer invest in environments that consistently undermine those values. The impact of this shift extends beyond dating. It affects workplace dynamics, consumer behavior, and social participation. When men learn to set boundaries in one area, they apply that skill elsewhere. This creates a broader cultural recalibration. For example, men become less tolerant of performative expectations. They prefer clear roles, fair exchange, and measurable outcomes. Ambiguity loses appeal. Transparency becomes a priority. This clarity also reduces susceptibility to manipulation. When incentives are clear, emotional hooks lose power. Men become harder to pressure into compliance through guilt or obligation. This autonomy reshapes interactions across the board. The resistance to this autonomy often comes from systems that benefited from male compliance. When compliance drops, those systems experience strain. Strain leads to criticism rather than reflection. That criticism further accelerates disengagement. It becomes a feedback loop. The more men are criticized for stepping back, the more justified they feel in staying back. Trust cannot be rebuilt through coercion. Rebuilding trust would require acknowledging past imbalances honestly. It would require changing how effort is recognized and reciprocated. It would require redefining expectations in a way that feels fair to all participants. So far, most responses have avoided this level of accountability. Surface level discussions dominate. Structural issues remain untouched. As long as that continues, disengagement will persist. Another important aspect is how digital environments distort perception. Online discourse amplifies extremes. Nuanced perspectives are drowned out. Men observing this chaos often conclude that offline peace is preferable to online conflict. They reduce exposure accordingly. Reducing exposure improves mental health. Improved mental health reinforces disengagement from stressful environments. Again, behavior follows outcome. Men also learn to differentiate between desire and obligation. In the past, obligation often masqueraded as desire. Once obligation is removed, genuine desire can be evaluated more honestly. In many cases, it was absent. This honesty is uncomfortable but freeing. It allows men to accept reality rather than chase ideals that do not align with experience. As disengagement becomes normalized, stigma weakens. What was once questioned becomes accepted. Social proof shifts. Men see others choosing peace and feel less pressure to justify their own choice. The role of friendship also changes. Male friendships deepen when they are not sidelined by dating pursuits. Support networks strengthen. Emotional expression becomes more acceptable within trusted circles. This counters the narrative that men rely solely on romantic relationships for emotional fulfillment. Many men discover that diversified connection is healthier and more resilient. The absence of constant romantic pursuit also allows men to appreciate their environment more fully. Hobbies become immersive. Travel becomes exploratory rather than performative. Life slows down in a beneficial way. Slowing down is often misinterpreted as stagnation, but growth does not always look frantic. Sustainable progress is quiet. As men adjust to this pace, they become less reactive. Emotional regulation improves. Decision making becomes more deliberate. These skills compound over time. From the outside, this can appear like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like alignment. Alignment is difficult to give up once achieved. It becomes a reference point. Any future engagement is evaluated against it. This is why calls to return to old patterns fall flat. They offer intensity without stability, familiar chaos without growth. Men are not unwilling to connect, they are unwilling to regress. The path forward, if one exists, requires redefining connection in ways that respect autonomy on both sides. It requires moving away from leverage based dynamics and toward cooperation. This is challenging in a culture accustomed to competition for attention. But without change, participation will continue to decline. The decline is not a crisis to be solved quickly, it is a signal to be understood carefully. Ignoring signals does not make them disappear, it amplifies their consequences. Men have already adjusted their behavior. Systems lag behind behavior, not the other way around. Eventually, norms follow reality. The question is how much friction occurs along the way. What remains clear is that peace has become a powerful motivator. Once experienced, it reshapes priorities permanently. Men who have stepped away are not waiting to be convinced. They are living according to what they have learned. And what they have learned is simple: stability matters, clarity matters, respect matters. Any future model of connection that does not center those principles will struggle to regain participation. This is not an ending, it is a recalibration, one that will continue until incentives and outcomes realign. And until then, men will continue choosing the option that offers them the most consistent return: peace. As this recalibration continues, a quiet but profound transformation is taking place in how men understand responsibility. Responsibility is no longer defined as absorbing endless pressure or sacrificing personal well being for outcomes they cannot control. Instead, responsibility is being redefined as stewardship over one's own life. Men are asking whether their time, energy, and resources are being used wisely. And if the answer is no, they are making changes without apology. This shift alone explains much of what we are seeing today. For years, responsibility was framed almost exclusively as external obligation: provide, protect, perform, adapt, endure. These expectations were presented as moral duties rather than negotiated roles. When men fulfilled them, it was considered normal. When men questioned them, it was considered selfish. That framing worked only as long as men believed the system they were serving was reciprocal. Once reciprocity disappeared, the moral framing lost its power. Men began to recognize that responsibility without agency is simply control by another name. Agency requires choice. Walking away restored choice. It allowed men to decide what responsibilities they would accept and which they would decline. That sense of control is deeply stabilizing. This stabilization is why many men report improved sleep, improved focus, and improved emotional regulation after disengaging. Chronic stress declined, decision fatigue declined. The constant vigilance required to navigate modern dating disappeared. What replaced it was mental space. Mental space creates perspective. Perspective reveals patterns. Patterns confirm decisions. This cycle reinforces disengagement in a way that is difficult to reverse. Another element often ignored is how narrative pressure shapes behavior. For years, men were told that if they did not pursue relationships aggressively, they would regret it later. Fear of future regret was used as motivation, but regret is not guaranteed. Many men discovered that regret was more likely when they stayed in draining situations than when they left them. This realization reframed risk. The risk was no longer missing out. The risk was staying in something misaligned for too long. Once that mental switch flipped, the calculus changed permanently. As more men shared these experiences privately with one another, confidence grew. The choice to disengage felt less isolating. It felt validated by shared outcomes. This peer reinforcement accelerated the trend quietly. Public discourse, however, lagged behind. Many narratives still assume male participation as default. When reality contradicts assumptions, tension arises. That tension is visible in confusion, frustration, and increasingly desperate attempts to explain away disengagement rather than understand it. Some explanations focus on technology, others on economics, others on personality shifts. All play a role, but none alone explain the scale of the change. The core issue remains value alignment. When effort consistently outweighs reward, behavior adjusts. Men also became more attuned to emotional consistency. They noticed how unpredictable dynamics affected their mood and productivity. Stability became a priority. This is not an absence of emotion, it is an intentional regulation of it. Emotional regulation is often misunderstood. It is not suppression, it is selection. Choosing which environments deserve emotional investment and which do not. Dating environments that produced anxiety rather than connection were deprioritized. As men refined the skill, they became less reactive overall. Conflicts lost intensity. External judgments lost influence. Internal standards replaced external approval. This internal orientation is a hallmark of psychological maturity. Ironically, this maturity made men less compatible with systems built on validation seeking and attention competition. What once felt exciting began to feel hollow. The mismatch widened. Men also became more honest with themselves about what they actually wanted, not what they were told to want, not what looked impressive, but what sustained them day to day. Simplicity often won. This simplicity extended to lifestyle choices, smaller social circles, fewer obligations, clearer routines, predictable schedules. These choices reduced chaos and increased satisfaction. From the outside, this can look like withdrawal from society. In reality, it is selective participation. Men still engage where engagement is rewarding. They simply disengage where it is not. The idea that men owe participation to maintain social balance misunderstands the nature of voluntary systems. Participation cannot be demanded, it must be earned through value. Dating, as it existed, stopped earning that value for many men. The response was logical. As disengagement normalized, it also changed how men evaluated advice. Advice rooted in outdated assumptions lost credibility. Men trusted lived experience over slogans. This skepticism extended beyond dating. Institutions that rely on compliance without reciprocity face similar challenges. Once people realize they have alternatives, they use them. Men discovered alternatives to constant romantic pursuit. These alternatives were not empty distractions. They were sources of fulfillment, mastery, progress, autonomy. These experiences met needs that dating often failed to meet. This does not mean relationships have no value. It means relationships must compete with peace. That is a high standard. Peace is not passive, it is actively maintained. Men who have it guard it carefully. Any potential disruption is evaluated critically. This evaluation makes impulsive engagement unlikely. It favors slow, deliberate decisions. This pace contrasts sharply with modern dating culture's emphasis on speed and novelty. The mismatch in pacing alone discourages reentry. Men accustomed to calm find frenetic environments exhausting. The longer men remain disengaged, the more their baseline shifts. What once felt normal now feels stressful. Returning to old patterns feels regressive. This is why incentives like discounts, boosts, or new features fail to attract them back. They address convenience, not cost. The cost is emotional. Emotional cost is often invisible until removed. Once removed, it is remembered vividly. Men do not forget what life felt like before disengagement. As this awareness spreads, it reshapes expectations for any future connection. Men are no longer willing to tolerate instability as the price of intimacy. They want both. Achieving both requires mutual effort and accountability. That requires cultural change, not individual persuasion. Cultural change is slow because it threatens existing power dynamics. But reality moves regardless of comfort. Men walking away is not a demand, it is a consequence. Consequences force adaptation eventually. The only question is how long denial persists. In the meantime, men continue building lives that feel coherent and sustainable. They invest in themselves without guilt. They pursue fulfillment without apology. This self directed approach does not eliminate desire for connection, it reframes it. Connection becomes something to enhance life, not define it. That distinction is critical. When connection defines life, loss feels catastrophic. When it enhances life, absence is tolerable. Men chose enhancement over dependency. As this choice becomes more widespread, it will influence how younger generations approach relationships from the start. Expectations will be different, boundaries will be clearer. This may lead to fewer relationships overall, but those that exist may be more stable. Quantity may decline, quality may improve, or the gap may widen further. Outcomes depend on adaptation. What is certain is that the old assumptions no longer hold. Men are not endlessly adaptable. They respond to incentives like everyone else. Ignoring that reality delays solutions. Acknowledging it opens the door to recalibration. Until recalibration occurs, disengagement remains the rational choice for many. Men have already done the math. They are living with the results. And as long as those results continue to deliver peace, clarity, and stability, the decision will stand. As the story reaches its conclusion, what stands out most is not anger, not conflict, and not resentment, but clarity. Clarity is the defining feature of this moment. Men did not wake up one day and decide to reject relationships, society, or connection. They woke up to patterns that repeated themselves over years, sometimes decades, and they made adjustments that favored stability over struggle. When clarity replaces confusion, behavior changes naturally. No speeches are required, no permission is needed. What many people still misunderstand is that men walking away is not an emotional tantrum or a social protest, it is an outcome. Outcomes follow incentives. For years, the incentive structure of modern dating rewarded imbalance, unpredictability, and emotional exhaustion. When men removed themselves from that environment, the improvement in their quality of life became undeniable. Once improvement is experienced, regression becomes unappealing. This is not stubbornness, it is self respect. The broader implications of the shift extend far beyond dating. They touch every area where men were expected to give without limit while receiving without certainty. Once men learn that disengagement is an option, they begin applying that lesson everywhere. They become more selective with work environments, social obligations, financial commitments, and emotional investments. This selectivity is not cruelty, it is discernment. Discernment is often framed negatively in a culture that benefits from compliance. But discernment is how healthy boundaries are formed. Boundaries protect energy. Energy fuels progress. Men who once felt depleted began to feel capable again, not because they were given something new, but because they stopped leaking energy into systems that drained them. This is why appeals to nostalgia fail. Telling men how things used to be does not outweigh how things feel now. Memory does not compete with lived experience. The peace men found after stepping away is not theoretical, it is measurable. It shows up in sleep, focus, finances, and mental health. No argument can override that. It is also important to acknowledge that this moment forces uncomfortable questions. Questions about fairness, about expectations, about whether modern relationship structures actually serve both sides or simply perpetuate conflict. These questions are not attacks, they are necessary reflections. Avoiding them does not make them disappear, it only delays the reckoning. Some will argue that this shift is unhealthy or unsustainable, but sustainability is exactly what men are pursuing. They are choosing lives they can maintain without constant emotional volatility. They are choosing predictability over drama. They are choosing responsibility with agency rather than obligation without choice. What this reveals is that men were not avoiding commitment, they were avoiding instability. They were not rejecting connection. They were rejecting environments where connection came with disproportionate risk. Once that distinction is understood, the narrative changes completely. There is no villain required for this story to make sense. Systems can fail without malice. Cultures can drift without intention. People adapt when outcomes no longer justify effort. That is not betrayal. That is reality. As the dating industry continues to shrink and reinvent itself, the deeper lesson remains unaddressed. Technology cannot manufacture trust. Algorithms cannot replace respect. Features cannot substitute for fairness. Until those fundamentals are restored, participation will remain low. This does not mean relationships are over. It means relationships must evolve. They must be built on mutual investment rather than leverage, on clarity rather than ambiguity, on cooperation rather than negotiation. Whether that evolution happens depends on whether people are willing to let go of outdated assumptions. Men are no longer waiting to be chosen, they are choosing themselves. That choice has consequences, both positive and challenging, but it is a choice rooted in self awareness rather than bitterness. Men discovered that life did not fall apart when they stopped chasing. In many cases, it improved. This improvement reframed everything. Work felt more meaningful, hobbies felt more immersive, friendships felt more honest, even silence felt restorative rather than empty. These experiences reshaped priorities permanently. Once priorities change, behavior follows. Once behavior changes at scale, culture shifts. We are in the middle of that shift now. There will be resistance, there will be denial, there will be attempts to shame, guilt, or pressure men back into old patterns. Those attempts will fail because they misunderstand the core motivation. Men are not seeking approval, they are seeking peace. Peace is not glamorous. It does not trend well on social media. It does not generate outrage or engagement, but it sustains life. People protect what sustains them. Any future model of connection that hopes to succeed will need to respect that reality. It will need to offer stability alongside intimacy, respect alongside attraction, reciprocity alongside desire. Without those elements, disengagement will continue. The era of endless tolerance is over. The era of conscious choice has begun. Men are no longer measuring success by how much they can endure. They are measuring it by how well they can live. That shift will echo for years. It will shape how younger generations form expectations. It will influence how relationships are negotiated from the start rather than corrected later. It will quietly redefine what partnership means. This is not the collapse of society, it is a correction. Corrections are uncomfortable, but they are necessary when imbalance goes unchecked for too long. The story of men walking away is ultimately a story about boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They determine what is allowed in and what is kept out. Men have refined their filters, and they are unlikely to discard them. As this chapter closes, the message is simple and grounded in reality. When people discover a way of living that brings them stability, clarity, and self respect, they do not abandon it lightly. They build on it. So the question is no longer why men walked away. The question is what systems will change as a result. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed today, whether you agree, what you have observed, and how you see this playing out. Leave a comment and share your thoughts below because this conversation matters and it is not going away. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.